Imagine you worked your entire life, saved diligently, followed every piece of financial advice you were ever given, put money into your 401k, bought a home in a good school district, paid your taxes, upgraded your car when the lease ran out, and then one day, someone sat you down and explained that every single one of those decisions was quietly, systematically being used against you. Not by a villain in a movie, not by some shadowy cabal meeting in a dark room, but by a set of interlocking economic structures so sophisticated, so deeply embedded into the fabric of everyday American life that most people participate in them willingly, even enthusiastically, without ever realizing the trap they've walked into. That's what we're talking about today. This is the story of financial autocannibalism, how the modern middle class has been engineered through a combination of deliberate policy choices and brilliant behavioral manipulation to fund its own economic destruction. And by the end of this video, you're going to look at your paycheck, your mortgage, your retirement account, and your grocery bill in a completely different way. Let's go. To understand where we are, we have to understand where we came from. And to do that, we need to travel back to the decades immediately following World War II, a period economists call the Great Compression, roughly 1947 to 1974. This was, by almost every measurable standard, the golden age of the American middle class. And here's what made it work. The economy operated as a genuine partnership between corporations, workers, and government. Markets were active and competitive, but they were balanced by strong public investment in infrastructure, education, and financial regulation. Corporations operated under a philosophy called stakeholder capitalism, which sounds like a buzzword today, but was a very real and concrete idea back then. It meant that a company's responsibility wasn't only to its shareholders, it was to its employees, its community, and the long-term health of the business itself. Workers were seen as assets to be developed and fairly compensated, not as line items to be minimized on a quarterly earnings report. Union density was high, which gave workers genuine collective bargaining power. And the result of all of this was a virtuous economic cycle. Productivity went up, wages went up proportionally, consumer spending increased, businesses grew, more workers were hired, and the whole engine kept turning. A man with nothing more than a high school diploma and a willingness to work hard could earn a stable, middle-class income, buy a home, raise a family, and reasonably expect his children to do even better than he did. That wasn't a fantasy. That was the lived reality for tens of millions of Americans. Then came the 1970s, and everything changed. The transformation wasn't accidental. It was organized. In 1971, a corporate lawyer named Lewis Powell, who would later become a Supreme Court justice, wrote a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that would become one of the most consequential documents in modern economic history. The Powell Manifesto, as it came to be known, was essentially a call to arms for the American business community. It argued that corporations needed to aggressively cultivate political influence, fund think tanks, reshape university curricula, and lobby for policies that favored capital over labor. And over the following decade, American business did exactly that. The consequences were profound. Markets were deregulated. Labor unions were systematically weakened. And most importantly, the entire philosophy of corporate governance was restructured around a single, obsessive goal: maximizing short-term shareholder value, regardless of the cost to workers, communities, or the long-term health of the companies themselves. The era of stakeholder capitalism was over. The era of shareholder primacy had begun. And the numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Since the 1970s, American worker productivity has continued to climb. Workers are producing more value per hour than at any point in human history. But real wages adjusted for inflation, have been essentially flat for the average worker for over 5 decades. The gains from all that productivity growth didn't flow to the people doing the work. They flowed to shareholders, to executive compensation, and to the financial system. And economists have calculated that if worker compensation had simply kept pace with productivity growth over this period, the average American worker today would be earning approximately $42,000 more per year. That's not a rounding error. That's a second income that was taken from the middle class and handed to the ownership class. Now layer on top of that another dynamic: corporate consolidation. As we'll see in a moment, ordinary middle-class savers have been pouring money into broad market index funds, S&P 500 trackers, total market funds, the kind of thing your financial advisor calls diversified. And those index funds have concentrated enormous voting power in the hands of a tiny group of asset management firms, companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. These firms use that concentrated ownership to support, or at least not obstruct, waves of corporate mergers and acquisitions that have transformed American labor markets into something economists call monopsonies. A monopsony is the labor market equivalent of a monopoly. Instead of a single seller dominating a market, you have a single buyer or a very small group of buyers dominating the purchase of labor in a given region. When there are only one or two major employers in your town, you don't negotiate your wage. You accept what you're offered or you leave. And more than 10% of the American workforce is currently working in exactly this kind of suppressed wage labor market. For specialized professions that can't easily relocate, registered nurses, pharmacists, security guards, the suppression is even worse. Studies have shown that 4 years after a major hospital merger, cumulative salary growth for medical professionals is over 6% lower than in competitive markets. 6% doesn't sound catastrophic until you compound it over a career, and then it becomes hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen lifetime earnings. The result of all of this, the wage suppression, the productivity theft, the consolidation, is that the shape of American income distribution has fundamentally changed. Economists apply something called the Arthur Lewis dual economy model, originally developed to describe developing nations, to the United States today, and it fits. The country has split. We've gone from a society with a large, dominant middle class, a bell curve with a big hump in the middle, to what economists call a camel distribution, with two humps, a mass of high-income earners at the top and a mass of low-income workers at the bottom, and a shrinking, hollowed-out middle in between. The middle class went from earning over 60% of national income in 1970 to just 40% by 2014. And the trend has not reversed. So, if wages have been stagnant, where does the middle class turn to build wealth? The answer, overwhelmingly, is the retirement savings system. And this is where the story gets genuinely dark, because the retirement savings apparatus, which most Americans treat as their primary wealth-building tool, is one of the most elegant mechanisms of wealth extraction ever devised. Let's go back to 1974. Congress passes the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA. On the surface, this law is designed to protect workers' retirement benefits. And in some ways it does. But it also has a paradoxical consequence. By codifying corporate obligations to fund traditional pension promises, it actually accelerates the death of those pensions. Major corporations, now legally on the hook for complex, long-term liabilities, begin freezing their defined benefit pension plans and replacing them with a new innovation, the 401k. The 401k was sold to the public as a democratization of capital. Suddenly, ordinary workers could invest in the stock market, take control of their financial futures, and build wealth just like the wealthy did. And on the surface, it sounds empowering. But what it actually represented was a massive, systematic transfer of risk from corporate balance sheets to individual households. Under the old defined benefit pension system, your employer made a promise. You work here for 30 years, and we will pay you a guaranteed monthly income for the rest of your life. The employer bore the risk. The market could crash, interest rates could rise, life expectancy could increase. None of that was your problem. Under the 401k model, all of that risk lands on you. If the market crashes the year before you retire, that's your problem. If you live longer than your savings, that's your problem. If you didn't save enough because your wages were stagnant and your fixed costs were rising, that's your problem. The corporations got an enormous gift. They offloaded decades of financial liability, and they sold it to workers as freedom. But the transfer of risk is only half the problem. The other half is the fee structure. The mutual fund industry has successfully lobbied against strict fee transparency for decades, which means the average 401k investor has no clear idea how much they're actually paying. Hidden administrative charges, sales commissions, fund management fees. These quietly compound over decades and can erode a third or more of your final retirement balance. A fee difference of just 1% per year sustained over a 30-year career, can reduce your retirement nest egg by 28%. That's not a typo. 1% per year, over time, costs you more than a quarter of your wealth. And then there's the tax subsidy structure. The federal government spends approximately $270 billion per year in retirement tax subsidies, deductions for 401k contributions, IRA deductions, and similar incentives. Sounds generous. Except that the overwhelming bulk of those subsidies flow to the top 20% of income earners, the people who have the most money to invest, and thus get the largest deductions. Lower and middle-income workers, the people who most need help building retirement security, get almost nothing from this system. The math of retirement savings under these conditions is brutal. A worker who starts saving at age 40 needs to set aside 25.8% of their gross annual income to achieve an 80% income replacement rate in retirement. 25.8%. For a family already stretched thin by stagnant wages and rising fixed costs, that number is not just difficult, it is mathematically impossible. And the data confirms this. High-income workers manage to save about 6% of their earnings. Workers in the bottom half of the income distribution save about 2.8%. The median retirement account balance for the bottom 50% of Americans, by wealth, is exactly $0. The median for the middle 40% of households is $60,000 against a retirement savings target of $600,000. They are 1/10 of the way there. And even that inadequate savings is being quietly pillaged by a behavior called leakage. Approximately 40% of workers between the ages of 20 and 39 cash out their 401k accounts entirely when they change jobs. They take the immediate penalty, 10% in taxes plus income taxes on the withdrawal, and spend the money now, sacrificing years of compounding growth in the process. This isn't stupidity. This is financial desperation. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, a few $1,000s in a retirement account feels like the only emergency fund you have access to. Now here's the twist that turns this from a personal tragedy into a structural catastrophe. All of this accumulated middle-class retirement savings, the 401k balances, the pension funds managed by state and local governments, doesn't just sit in a vault somewhere. It gets deployed into financial markets. And pension fund managers, desperately trying to meet long-term obligations with inadequate contributions, have increasingly turned to private equity, hedge funds, and real estate partnerships to chase higher returns. Over $1 trillion, roughly 1/5 of total public pension assets, has been funneled into these alternative investments. And what do private equity firms do with that money? They execute leveraged buyouts. They buy assets. And increasingly, the assets they're buying are homes. By June 2022, private equity-backed firms owned at least 1.6 million housing units in the United States, over 1 million apartments, 275,000 manufactured housing lots, and 240,000 single-family homes. Once they own these properties, they do what private equity always does. They optimize for maximum short-term returns. They aggressively raise rents. They add exorbitant administrative fees and utility charges. They cut maintenance costs by neglecting repairs. They squeeze every possible dollar out of tenants because they've promised their investors, including those pension funds, returns of 15 to 20%. Do you see the loop closing? Middle-class workers put money into their pension funds and 401k accounts. Those funds invest in private equity. Private equity buys housing. Private equity raises rents. Those same middle-class workers can no longer afford to buy homes or pay rent. Their wages are stagnant. Their housing costs are skyrocketing. And their own retirement savings are the engine driving the process. They are, in the most literal sense, funding their own displacement. At this point in the video, someone is probably thinking, okay, but isn't part of the problem that people just spend too much? All those iPhones and Netflix subscriptions and avocado toast. And I want to address that head-on because the data tells a very different story. Legal scholar and former Senator Elizabeth Warren spent years compiling detailed consumption data comparing middle-class families today with their counterparts a generation ago. And what she found completely demolished the overconsumption narrative. When you adjust for inflation and compare apples to apples, the average middle-class family today actually spends less on clothing, less on food, including restaurant meals, less on major household appliances, and less on electronics than a single-income family spent in the 1970s. The idea that middle-class financial distress is caused by frivolous spending on luxuries is not just wrong. It is a deliberate misdirection that serves the interests of those who benefit from the actual causes of the crisis. So, what's actually driving the financial squeeze? Fixed costs. Non-negotiable, unavoidable, contractual expenses that have risen dramatically faster than wages. Housing, healthcare, childcare, higher education. Here's how the trap was built. Because the quality of your child's public education is determined by the property tax base of the municipality where you live, parents are forced into a spatial bidding war for homes in high-performing school districts. To get your kid into a good school, you need to buy a house in the right zip code. And you're not the only one who figured this out. Every other dual-income family in your income bracket has figured it out too. So prices in desirable school districts get bid up far beyond what the underlying housing market would otherwise support, and families have to stretch their borrowing to the absolute limit to win. And here's the cruel mathematics. To win that bidding war and secure that mortgage, you need two incomes. A dual-income household today earns about 75% more nominal income than a single-income household of the 1970s. Sounds like progress. Except that once they've paid their fixed monthly bills, the mortgage, 2 car payments for the suburban commute, health insurance premiums, childcare costs, they have 25% less discretionary cash flow than that single-income family from 50 years ago. The second income has been completely consumed. It's not building wealth. It's servicing debt. And this creates a structural fragility that didn't exist for previous generations. Think about the single-income household of the 1950s or 1960s. If the breadwinner got sick, got laid off, or was injured, the family had an enormous hidden asset, the unpaid domestic labor of the stay-at-home spouse. That person could enter the workforce and generate income. Or they could care for sick relatives directly, eliminating the need to pay for external care. The household had a shock absorber built in. In a modern dual-income household, that shock absorber is gone. Both adults are already fully deployed in the labor market, working full-time simply to cover fixed liabilities. If either income disappears, due to illness, job loss, or divorce, the household immediately cannot service its debts. The mortgage goes unpaid. The health insurance lapses. And the family slides toward foreclosure and bankruptcy with shocking speed. This is not a failure of personal character. This is a structural trap. And the research reflects it. Having children has become the single best statistical predictor that an American woman will declare bankruptcy. Not gambling. Not reckless spending. Having children. The system of rising fixed costs didn't emerge randomly. Higher education is a perfect example of how it works. Public university tuition has historically risen at 3 times the rate of inflation, not because universities suddenly became more expensive to operate, but because states have systematically defunded public higher education, forcing universities to shift costs onto students, who finance those costs with debt. That debt then follows graduates for decades, suppressing their ability to save, invest, or buy homes. The student loan industry, meanwhile, collects billions in interest on that debt. Wages flat. Tuition tripled in real terms. Debt exploded. And the wealth generated by that debt flows upward. The structural forces we've described so far, wage suppression, the retirement savings trap, the two-income squeeze, are powerful enough on their own. But they've been made dramatically more effective by a layer of sophisticated behavioral engineering. The financial services and consumer retail industries have spent decades studying human psychology, and they've developed tools to exploit our cognitive biases in ways that make our financial self-destruction feel not just acceptable, but natural. The most important of these tools is what behavioral economists call monthly payment thinking. At some point in the last few decades, the benchmark for whether you could afford something shifted from its total price to its monthly payment. Can you afford a $35,000 car? Probably not. Can you afford $599 per month? Maybe. And so the $35,000 car gets sold as a $599 per month obligation, and the actual total cost, including financing charges, interest, and the long-term opportunity cost of that capital, never really enters your mind. This pricing architecture is now everywhere. Cars are sold by monthly payment. Homes are sold by monthly payment. Gym memberships, streaming services, software subscriptions, smartphone plans, everything is broken down into a small recurring charge that feels negligible in isolation but accumulates into a rigid, crushing structure of fixed monthly obligations. Each individual commitment feels minor. But stack a dozen of them together and you've built a cage around your cash flow where there's no room for savings, no margin for error, and no ability to respond to crisis. Then there's lifestyle inflation, or as it's sometimes called, lifestyle creep. This is the behavioral phenomenon where every time your income increases, your spending increases by roughly the same amount. You get a raise, so you trade up your car. You get a promotion, so you move to a bigger house. Your discretionary income expands for a moment, and then your fixed costs expand to match it. The savings rate never actually improves. The treadmill just gets faster. Driving all of this is what researchers call the better-than dynamic. Human beings are not calibrated to evaluate their financial situation in absolute terms. We evaluate it in relative terms compared to our neighbors, our siblings, our college friends, our social media feeds. And because we want to feel that we're doing at least as well as the people around us, we consume in ways that signal status and success, even when those signals are hollow. We buy depreciating consumer goods, cars, gadgets, fashion, and we mistake them for assets. We confuse looking wealthy with being wealthy. And the distinction matters enormously. Here's a concept that cuts to the heart of this: the difference between assets and liabilities. A true asset is something that consistently puts money into your pocket, a rental property generating rent, a stock holding generating dividends, a business generating cash flow. A liability is something that consistently takes money out of your pocket. And by this definition, the things that middle-class Americans treat as their greatest financial achievements are actually their greatest liabilities. Your primary home is the most common example. Most middle-class families consider their home their primary asset, the cornerstone of their financial life. And it's true that homes can appreciate in value over decades. But throughout the entire time you're living in it, a home is a liability. It requires mortgage payments, interest payments, property taxes, homeowners insurance, and continuous maintenance. It produces no cash flow. You cannot easily access its value without selling it or taking on more debt. And it keeps you tied to a specific location in ways that limit your economic mobility. The same logic applies to luxury cars, brand-name goods, and premium experiences. These things generate no returns. They depreciate. They signal affluence while quietly destroying it. And the people who actually accumulate substantial wealth, the ones financial researchers call prodigious accumulators of wealth, understand this intuitively. They drive used cars purchased with cash. They live in modest homes in middle-class neighborhoods, well below what their income could support. They keep their lifestyle expenses low, and they concentrate their capital in things that generate actual returns: stocks, businesses, investment real estate. Research on estates valued at $3.5 million or more reveals a striking pattern. The median value of the primary home belonging to genuinely wealthy individuals was only $469,000, less than 10% of their total net worth. The vast majority of their wealth was concentrated in investment real estate and ownership stakes in regional businesses. And this points to something important about where wealth really comes from in America. The top 1% of earners are not, primarily, Wall Street executives or tech moguls. They are owners of unglamorous regional businesses, beverage distributors, auto dealerships, dental practices, law firms, grocery chains. Businesses that generate steady, reliable cash flows year after year. That's the actual engine of wealth accumulation. Not the fancy lifestyle. Not the status symbols. The boring, profitable business. But the middle class has been conditioned to pursue the opposite, to concentrate its net worth in a liquid, non-productive assets, a home you can't easily sell, a 401k you can't touch until you're 60, while carrying high-interest consumer debt and generating no cash-flowing assets whatsoever. This is what researchers call the middle-class trap. High paper net worth, zero liquidity, and catastrophic vulnerability to any disruption of the income stream. When wages are flat, fixed costs are rising, and behavioral engineering is pushing continuous consumption, there's only one bridge that keeps the whole structure standing: debt. And the scale of consumer debt accumulation in America over the last half-century is staggering. Between 1980 and the mid-2000s, revolving consumer credit card debt alone climbed 15-fold, from $51 billion to over $770 billion. Non-revolving installment debt jumped from just under $300 billion to over $1.5 trillion. Combined with residential mortgages, total consumer indebtedness crossed $15 trillion at its peak. Approximately 15% of American families spend more than 40 cents of every after-tax dollar they earn on debt servicing alone, just paying the interest and minimum payments on what they owe. They're not building wealth. They're barely treading water. This debt-fueled framework hit its logical conclusion in the subprime mortgage crisis of 2007 and 2008. In the years leading up to the crash, the share of subprime mortgages in total loan originations had exploded from 5% in 1994 to 20% by 2006, from $35 billion to $600 billion. The median down payment for first-time homebuyers had fallen to just 2%. And 43% of first-time buyers were making no down payment at all. When the Federal Reserve raised interest rates and the housing bubble burst, the delinquency rate on consumer debt nearly doubled in less than 2 years. Millions of foreclosures followed. The global financial system contracted violently. Households did manage to pay down some of that debt in the years following the crisis, about $1.4 trillion between 2008 and 2012, through a combination of voluntary repayment and write-offs. But the structural conditions that created the debt accumulation in the first place, flat wages, rising fixed costs, behavioral engineering toward consumption, never changed. The debt came back. And by late 2025, the picture had grown even more troubling. Real estate net worth declined across income brackets in the fourth quarter of 2025. But the damage was not evenly distributed. For families in the 40th to 60th percentile of income, the heart of the middle class, mortgage debt expanded by $10 billion while underlying real estate values fell by $30 billion. Their home equity effectively went to zero. Meanwhile, the top 20% of income earners own more than $50 trillion, roughly 87%, of all corporate equity and mutual fund holdings in the country. The K-shape of the economy has become unmistakable. One group is ascending, capital owners accumulating vast wealth. The other is descending, wage earners caught in a debt trap, their primary asset deflating while their liabilities grow. Act 6. Corporate Welfare and the Fiscal Trap. 46:00 to 53:00. If all of this weren't enough, middle-class households are also being taxed to fund a parallel system of corporate welfare that transfers their money directly to the largest corporations and wealthiest financial institutions in the world. In 2025, the federal government spent approximately $181 billion on corporate welfare, direct subsidies, grants, low-interest loans, and specialized tax expenditures for large corporations. State and local governments added another $40 to $50 billion. And while there are arguments to be made for targeted industrial policy in strategic sectors, the reality is that much of this money flows to companies that are already enormously profitable, distorting markets and rewarding lobbying over genuine innovation. Tax codes at the state and local level are structured in ways that collect a larger percentage of income from low- and middle-income families than from the wealthy, what tax policy researchers call upside-down tax structures. When financial institutions make catastrophic bets and lose, the middle class is called upon to cover the losses. During the global financial crisis of 2008, the federal government deployed $250 billion to bail out the banks that had engineered the subprime mortgage catastrophe. In 2023, when Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic collapsed, the government again stepped in, this time guaranteeing all deposits, including those far above the $250,000 FDIC limit. This was, in effect, a massive public subsidy to venture capitalists and technology executives. And the bank's assets were sold to even larger banks, further concentrating the financial system, further eliminating competition, and further reducing credit options for small businesses and local communities. And hovering over all of this is the demographic time bomb of Social Security and Medicare. These programs face an estimated $38 trillion funding shortfall over the next 75 years. The pay-as-you-go model, where current workers fund current retirees, is being strained to breaking point by the retirement of 77 million baby boomers. In 1960, 5 workers supported each retiree. That ratio has fallen to 3-to-1 today and is projected to reach 2-to-1 by 2030, meaning every working couple will effectively be funding their own retiree. According to Congressional Budget Office projections, keeping all current entitlement promises without structural reform would eventually require raising the middle-class tax bracket to 63%. The middle class is caught in a fiscal vice, taxed to fund corporate bailouts and subsidies today, facing the prospect of either a gutted safety net or crushing tax rates tomorrow. So what do? Is there a way out of this? I want to be honest with you. The structural forces we've described are massive, deeply entrenched, and actively maintained by people and institutions with enormous resources and political power. Individual frugality, while important at the household level, cannot solve a systemic problem. What is required is structural reform. And here are the interventions that economists and policy researchers argue would actually move the needle. First, decouple housing from education. The single most destructive feature of the American education housing nexus is that public school quality is tied to local property taxes. This one design choice forces millions of families into ruinous bidding wars for homes in good school districts. Open enrollment systems and well-designed school choice programs can break this link, allowing families to access high-quality education without being forced to buy premium real estate. Second, impose tuition controls on public universities and implement universal preschool. Public university tuition has risen at 3 times the rate of inflation for decades. Conditioning federal and state funding on tuition freezes would halt this trend. And universal preschool would eliminate one of the largest fixed costs facing families with young children, freeing up income for savings and investment. Third, replace or supplement the 401k with guaranteed retirement accounts. The individual-directed, high-fee, market-exposed 401k model has failed the majority of Americans. A universal system requiring a combined 5% contribution from employers and employees, pooled into low-cost, professionally managed funds providing guaranteed, inflation-indexed annuities, would actually deliver retirement security rather than the illusion of it. Fourth, regulate institutional investment in single-family housing. Private equity firms using pension fund capital to monopolize the residential housing market is not a free market outcome. It's a market distortion that destroys homeownership opportunities for ordinary families. Strict limits and tax penalties on institutional acquisition of single-family homes and affordable multifamily properties would restore balance to the housing market. Fifth, apply genuine antitrust enforcement to labor markets. Regulators must evaluate the impact of corporate mergers not just on product market competition, but on labor market competition. Transactions that create monopsonistic employer concentration should be blocked. Sixth, restore usury laws and cap consumer interest rates. The deregulation of consumer credit in the late 1970s removed the interest rate ceilings that had protected borrowers for centuries. Restoring those protections, capping credit card rates, regulating buy now pay later schemes, limiting predatory lending, would prevent families from falling into debt spirals they can never escape. Seventh, reform the bank resolution process. Instead of selling failed banks to megabanks like J.P. Morgan Chase, further concentrating financial power, the FDIC should convert failed institutions into public benefit banks. This preserves regional competition, protects small business lending, and breaks the too-big-to-fail consolidation cycle. Let me bring this back to where we started. The middle class has been told, for decades, that its financial struggles are the result of personal failure. That if you just spent less on coffee, just budgeted more carefully, just worked harder, things would be fine. That the problem is you. But the evidence tells a different story. The evidence tells us that real wages have been flat for 50 years, that the retirement savings system is designed to extract fees rather than build security, that housing costs are being deliberately inflated by institutions operating with middle-class pension money, that behavioral engineering is specifically designed to prevent wealth accumulation, and that the tax system funds corporate bailouts while threatening to gut the safety net. The middle class is not failing. The middle class is being failed by a system that has, with great sophistication and deliberate intent, turned the financial behaviors of ordinary households into fuel for the wealth accumulation of the few. Knowing this doesn't solve the problem overnight, but it does change what you're looking at. The first step is always to see the system clearly, to stop blaming yourself for structural outcomes, to understand the trap before you can find the exit. And the exit exists. But finding it requires honesty about the economy we actually live in, the institutions that actually govern our financial lives, and the reforms that would actually make a difference. If this video gave you a clearer picture of that system, share it. Because this conversation needs to be happening everywhere, at kitchen tables and policy rooms, and in the public discourse. The middle class built this country. It deserves to know who is taking it apart and how.